Dust settled on her borrowed boots as the train blasted its whistle and abandoned her. No husband waiting, just a telegram blowing in the dirt. Cora had $2, a trunk of useless calico, and a choice: freeze in a ghost town or walk up the mountain. Coal ash grated between Cora's back teeth. She ran a dry tongue over her lips, tasting soot and the bitter metallic tang of her own exhaustion. The station platform at Oakhaven wasn't a platform at all. It was just a stretch of beaten earth beside a water tower that leaked a steady, rhythmic drip into a muddy puddle. The man who was supposed to marry her wasn't here. His name was supposed to be Arthur. He had written letters on thick, cream-colored paper, making promises about a sprawling ranch and a life far away from the cramped, coughing squalor of the Chicago boarding house she'd scrubbed floors in for 10 years. But the station master, a man with rheumy eyes and breath that smelled of stale onions, had just spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dirt and told her the truth. Arthur had gone bust. Packed up his wagon 3 weeks ago and headed for California, leaving nothing behind but unpaid debts at the mercantile. Cora didn't cry. She had stopped crying over men when her father drank his way into a shallow grave. Instead, a cold, heavy stone settled at the bottom of her stomach. She looked at her trunk. It held 3 cotton dresses, a pair of woolen stockings, and a cracked porcelain comb. Useless. All of it. "Town's dead, miss," the station master rasped, leaning on his broom. "Ain't no boarding house here. Snow's coming over the ridge by nightfall." Cora looked up. The mountain loomed above the valley, a massive, jagged spine of dark pine and gray rock. The air was already biting, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and impending frost. "Is there anywhere up there?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Just old man Emmett's claim, up the logging trail, about a 3-mile climb, but he ain't exactly hospitable." Cora traded her trunk and the dresses inside to the station master for a heavy, moth-eaten wool coat, a tin of hardtack, and a box of matches. She kept her boots, though. They pinched her toes mercilessly and began to walk. The climb was brutal. Within the first mile, the wind picked up, driving icy needles of sleet against her cheeks. The leather of her boots, stiff and unforgiving, rubbed the backs of her heels raw. She felt the warm, sticky seep of a blister popping, then the stinging friction of rough wool socks grinding into open skin. She didn't stop. To stop meant to freeze. Her breathing grew ragged, tearing at her throat. The forest around her groaned, the massive pines swaying and creaking like the hulls of wooden ships. By the time she saw the cabin, the sun had dropped behind the peaks, plunging the woods into a deep, bruised purple. It was a rough-hewn structure, tucked against a granite outcrop. No smoke rose from the stone chimney. The windows were shuttered. It looked dead. Cora pushed against the heavy timber door. It gave way with a screech of rusted iron hinges. She stepped inside, dragging her numb feet over the threshold, and immediately clamped a hand over her mouth. The smell hit her like a physical blow. It was a suffocating mix of rotting meat, stale sweat, dried urine, and copper. "Close it." The voice was a dry, scraping sound, barely human. Cora squinted into the gloom. On a low cot in the corner lay a man. He was a tangle of greasy, dark hair and heavy beard, his face flushed a dark, unnatural red. A massive buffalo robe was kicked down to his waist. His left leg was propped up, wrapped in what used to be a white flour sack. It was now black, with dried blood, and wet with yellow seepage. But what held Cora's attention was the heavy barrel of the Sharp's rifle resting on his knee, pointed directly at her chest. His arms shook. The barrel rattled faintly against a wooden bedpost. He was trying to aim, but he lacked the strength to hold the weapon steady. "Scavenger," he breathed, his chest heaving with the effort. "Get out. I ain't dead yet." Cora stood perfectly still. Fear should have sent her running back into the snow, but she was too cold, too tired, and too angry at the world to be terrified. She looked at the rattling gun, then at his fever-glassy eyes. "If you're going to shoot me, do it quickly," Cora said, her voice flat, devoid of any tremble. "Otherwise, I'm closing the door. You're letting the draft in." The man stared at her, his jaw working as if trying to form another threat. The whites of his eyes rolled up. The rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floorboards. He slumped back against the bare mattress, unconscious. Cora stood there for a long minute, listening to his ragged, wet breathing. She looked back at the open door, where snow was beginning to drift over the threshold. Slowly, painfully, she reached out and pulled the heavy door shut. Survival makes scavengers of us all. Cora didn't tend to Emmett out of some innate maternal desire to heal. She did it because the wind was howling against the chinking. The temperature inside the cabin was dropping below freezing, and she couldn't drag a dead man out of a bed she desperately needed to sleep in. She found the woodpile stacked haphazardly by the hearth. Her hands, stiff and clumsy with cold, managed to strike a match and get a fire going from a pile of dry kindling and pitch-heavy bark. As the flames caught, casting erratic, dancing shadows across the log walls, the cabin began to thaw. With the heat came a worsening of the smell. Cora pulled off her coat and approached the cot. Emmett lay unmoving, his chest rising and falling in shallow, jerky spasms. Sweat beaded on his forehead, tracking through the grime on his face. Cora swallowed the bile rising in her throat and reached for the blood-soaked flour sack tied around his thigh. The fabric was crusted to the wound. As she tugged it, Emmett groaned, an animal sound of pure agony, and thrashed blindly. Cora leaned her weight on his good leg to keep him still, gritting her teeth. "Hold still, damn you," she hissed, prying the fabric loose. When it finally tore free, she gagged. It was a deep axe wound, an ugly, gaping slash that had gone angry and infected. Red streaks spiderwebbed up his pale skin toward his hip. The flesh around the edges was swollen and hot to the touch, oozing thick, foul-smelling pus. She turned away, stumbling to the wash basin by the door, and dry heaved into it. Her stomach was completely empty, leaving her with nothing but painful spasms in her diaphragm. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, spitting a foul taste onto the floorboards. "Leave him," a voice in her head whispered. "Take his food, take his heavy coat, and walk back down when the storm breaks." But she remembered the dark, empty valley. She remembered the station master's indifferent eyes. There was nowhere to go. If she let this man die, she'd be truly alone up here. Cora found a heavy iron kettle, filled it from a water barrel in the corner, and suspended it over the fire. She tore the cleanest parts of her own petticoat into strips. She found a bottle of cheap, raw whiskey in a crate near his bed. When the water boiled, she carried it over. What followed was a brutal, ugly wrestling match. She poured a splash of the whiskey directly into the open gash. Emmett screamed. It wasn't a stoic, manly grunt. It was a raw, tearing sound. His eyes snapped open, wild and unseeing, and he swung a heavy, calloused fist blindly, catching Cora on the shoulder and knocking her backward onto the floor. She hit the hard wood, the breath rushing from her lungs. Pain radiated down her arm. For a second, she just lay there, staring at the ceiling rafters. She wanted to cry. She wanted to scream back at him. Instead, she dragged herself back up. She grabbed his flailing wrists, pinning them with her knees as she crouched over him. "I am trying to save your miserable life," she yelled, right into his face. He blinked, panting, the fever making him delirious. "Water," he choked out. Over the next 3 days, time blurred into a cycle of boiling water, cleaning the wound, packing it with damp, clean cloth, and trying to force thin, watery bean broth down his throat. Cora slept in snatches on a hard wooden chair pulled up to the fire, waking every few hours to add logs and check his breathing. She emptied his slop bucket out the back door, her hands cracking and bleeding from the cold and the constant washing. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm broke. Sunlight, blindingly bright, streamed through the cracks in the window shutters. Cora was sitting at the small table, scraping the last bit of hardtack from her tin, when a voice broke the silence. It wasn't a rasp this time. It was deep, rough, and perfectly coherent. "You're eating my provisions." Cora froze. She lowered the tin and turned slowly. Emmett was awake. The fever flush was gone from his face, leaving him pale and gaunt beneath the heavy beard. His dark eyes, sharp and lucid, were fixed on her. "I used your provisions to keep you from dying," Cora said, keeping her voice level. "You're welcome." Emmett shifted on the bed, wincing as the movement pulled at his leg. He looked down at the clean white cotton wrapped tightly around his thigh, then back at her. He didn't look grateful. He looked suspicious. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Cora. That don't mean nothing to me. Are you a thief? A squatter?" I'm a mail-order bride whose intended husband ran off to California, she snapped, the exhaustion finally eroding her restraint. I was left at the station. I climbed up here so I wouldn't freeze to death. And since I spent the last 3 days digging rot out of your leg and cleaning up your filth, I figure you owe me room and board. Emmett stared at her. He took in her tangled hair, the dark circles under her eyes, and the dirt smudged across her jaw. He looked at her boots, sitting by the hearth, and the blood-stained woolen socks draped over them. I don't need help, he muttered stubbornly, looking away. Especially not from a city woman who don't know how to survive. You were dying, Cora pointed out flatly. I was resting. Cora let out a short, harsh laugh. She stood up, walking over to the cot, looking down at him. You were rotting, Mr. Emmett. If I hadn't walked through that door, you'd be a corpse by tomorrow. He glared up at her, a muscle feathering in his jaw. There was pride there, rigid and unbending. He hated being vulnerable. He hated that she had seen him weak, screaming, out of his mind with fever. I didn't ask you to come here, he said softly, his voice tight. And I didn't ask to be left with nothing, Cora replied, her tone matching his. Looks like we're both stuck with things we didn't ask for. She turned her back on him, walked to the fire, and lifted the heavy kettle to pour herself a cup of his coffee. She could feel his eyes on her back, heavy, evaluating, and completely untrusting. The silence stretched between them, thick full of the smell of wood smoke and the bitter realization that neither of them was going anywhere. The winter did not arrive. It descended, a suffocating white blanket that buried the cabin up to the bottom sills of the windows. The world outside shrank to the path Cora shoveled to the woodpile and the frozen creek. Inside, the space was barely 20 feet across, filled with the constant, heavy smell of wood smoke, curing animal hides, and unwashed bodies. They lived in a forced, suffocating orbit around the stone hearth. Emmett's leg healed, but it healed ugly. The flesh knit together in a jagged, ropey scar that pulled tight against his muscle, leaving him with a dragging limp that scraped against the floorboards times step, scuff, step, scuff. Every time Cora heard that sound, her jaw tightened. It was a constant reminder of his vulnerability, something he fiercely resented. He refused to stay in the cot once the fever broke. On the second week of the freeze, Cora watched him try to pull on his heavy canvas trousers. His hands shook. Sweat beaded on his upper lip from the effort of bending his stiffened knee. She stood by the cast-iron stove, stirring a pot of scorched oats. She wanted to help him. She wanted to walk over, take the canvas fabric, and pull it over his boot. But she didn't move. She watched the rigid set of his jaw and the fierce, dark warning in his eyes. He would rather fall and crack his skull on the hearthstone than have her pull his pants up for him. You're burning the oats, he grunted, leaning heavily against the bedpost, breathless but dressed. If you don't like the cooking, you are welcome to take over the stove, Cora said without turning around. She scraped the bottom of the pot with a wooden spoon. The sharp smell of charred grain filled the air. Can't stand over a hot stove, he muttered, reaching for a crude crutch he'd carved from a piece of seasoned hickory. Got traps to check. You're a fool if you go out in this wind. Emmett ignored her. He wrapped a thick wool scarf around his neck, grabbed his heavy coat, and dragged himself out the door. The wind immediately howled through the opening, biting at Cora's ankles before the heavy timber slammed shut. She ate her oats in silence. The cabin felt massive and hollow without him. For all his gruffness, his physical presence was an anchor in the howling isolation of the mountain. Cora spent the next 3 hours scrubbing the rough-hewn table with sand and water, working until her knuckles bled, just to keep her mind off the image of him freezing to death in a snowdrift. When the door finally crashed open, it was late afternoon. Emmett stumbled inside, bringing a blast of frigid air and the coppery scent of fresh blood. He tossed 3 frozen rabbits onto the floor by the wash basin. He looked exhausted. His lips were a pale, dangerous blue, and his bad leg was visibly trembling. Cora dropped her rag. She walked over, grabbed the heavy coat by the lapels, and forcefully peeled it off his shoulders. He was too tired to fight her. Sit down, she ordered, pushing him toward the chair by the fire. He collapsed into it with a heavy sigh that sounded almost like a defeat. Cora knelt by his feet. She didn't ask permission. She grabbed the heel of his snow-crusted boot and began to pry it off. Emmett flinched as the leather pulled against his bad leg, but he didn't pull away. Found the snares, he rasped. staring down at her bent head. Fox got to two of them, saved those three. "It's meat," Cora said, her voice softer than she intended. She pulled off the second boot, revealing damp, freezing, woolen socks. She peeled those off too, pressing his icy, calloused bare feet toward the radiant heat of the hearth. He watched her hands. They were no longer the soft hands of a woman fresh off a train. The nails were chipped, the skin cracked and stained with soot and grease. She had traded her city softness for survival. "You didn't have to stay," Emmett said abruptly. The words sounded like they had been torn out of his throat. Cora looked up. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the deep lines around his eyes and the tangled mess of his beard. He wasn't looking at her with hostility anymore. It was a heavy, evaluating stare, full of internal contradiction. He hated being a burden, but he was looking at her like a man drowning who had finally realized someone had thrown him a rope. "I didn't have anywhere else to go, Emmett," she said simply. "Could have walked down when the pass was clear, found another man in the valley, a man with 2 good legs and a proper house." Cora stood up, her knees popping in the quiet cabin. She grabbed a rag and walked over to the frozen, bloody rabbits on the floor. "I've had my fill of men who make promises on paper," Cora said, pulling a skinning knife from the block. "I prefer the ones who bring home dinner, even if they have to drag their leg to do it." Emmett didn't say anything to that. He just stared into the fire. But later that night, after Cora had fallen asleep in the chair, shivering under her thin blanket, she woke up to a heavy weight pressing down on her. The cabin was pitch black. The smell of cured leather, wood smoke, and a faint, musky scent of sweat wrapped around her. Emmett had draped his massive buffalo robe over her. From the darkness across the room, she heard his steady breathing. He was freezing on his narrow cot, just so she could be warm. Cora pulled the thick fur up to her chin, closed her eyes, and for the first time since she arrived on the mountain, she felt entirely safe. Spring did not come with blooming flowers and singing birds. It came with mud. By late April, the snowpack began to rot. The mountain wept. Water dripped relentlessly from the eaves, carving deep brown trenches into the slush around the cabin. The creek swelled into a violent, roaring torrent of gray water. The smell of the forest changed from sharp, sterile ice to the damp, heavy funk of decaying leaves and wet earth. The pass was open. Cora stood on the small porch, a damp wind tugging at her loose hair. She watched Emmett down by the woodpile. He was splitting logs. He still limped, and he probably always would, but the sickly pallor was gone from his skin. His arms swung the heavy iron axe in a steady, rhythmic arc. Thwack, crack. The wood splintered cleanly. He was whole again. He didn't need a nurse. He didn't need a scavenger. Cora turned and went back inside. The cabin was spotless, or at least as clean as dirt floors and log walls could be. She walked over to her corner and began to gather her few belongings. Her heavy coat, the tin cup, a small, smoothed piece of quartz she had found in the creek. She felt a hollow ache in her chest, a tight, squeezing sensation that she fiercely tried to ignore. She was a practical woman. The transaction was complete. She had saved his life. He had kept her fed and sheltered through the winter. The ledger was balanced. The door creaked open. Emmett stood on the threshold, bringing the smell of pine pitch and damp wool with him. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a scarred hand. He looked at the small pile of items on the table, then looked at her. "What are you doing?" he asked. His voice was low, devoid of its usual rough edge. "The snow is gone," Cora said, not meeting his eyes. She carefully folded her spare pair of stockings. The station master said, "Wagons start coming through Oakhaven in May. I need to get down there before I miss them." Emmett stepped inside. He closed the door behind him. The sudden quiet in the cabin felt heavy, pressurized. He walked to the wash basin, poured a splash of water, and scrubbed his face. He took his time, drying his hands on a rough towel. "You got money for a ticket?" he asked, staring at the wall. "I have $2, Cora lied. She had nothing. She had traded her last $2 for the coat. "Ain't enough to get far. It's enough to get away from here." She finally looked at him. She wanted him to say something. She wanted him to give her a reason to stay, but she refused to beg for it. Emmett limped slowly across the room. He didn't go to the table. Instead, he went to his cot. He reached underneath it and pulled out a heavy canvas sack. He untied the thick hemp cord and walked over to where she stood. He dumped the contents onto the table. A shower of gold nuggets, some as small as peas, others as large as walnuts, clattered against the wood. The dull, heavy thud of raw wealth sounded foreign in the poor, dirt-stained cabin. Cora stared at the gold, her breath catching in her throat. What is this? Claim paid out 2 years ago, Emmett said, his voice flat. Kept it buried. Didn't trust the banks in town. You had this the whole time? While we were eating scorched oats and stringy rabbit? Gold don't buy flour when the pass is closed, he stated practically. He reached out and pushed the pile toward her. Take it. Cora took a step back, her eyes flashing. I am not a charity case, Emmett. I don't want your money. It ain't charity. He looked at her, his dark eyes, intense, stripped of all their usual defenses. It's a repayment. You saved my life. You dug the rot out of my leg while I fought you like a wild dog. You stayed. I stayed because I had to. You could have put a pillow over my face and taken the gold yourself, he countered gruffly. You didn't. Cora looked at the pile of wealth. It was enough to buy a house in Chicago, enough to buy a dozen fancy silk dresses, enough to never have to scrub another man's floor for the rest of her life. It was everything she had wanted when she boarded that train. She looked from the gold to Emmett. He was standing stiffly, his weight resting on his good leg. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets. He looked terrified. So, you're paying me off, Cora said, her voice trembling slightly with a sudden sharp anger. Washing your hands of the stray you took in. Emmett's jaw clenched. He pulled his hands out of his pockets. In his right hand, he held something else. He set it on the table, next to the gold. It was a pair of boots. They weren't the cheap, stiff, factory-made boots she had arrived in. These were handcrafted from thick, soft, oil-cured deer hide. The stitching was meticulous, reinforced with heavy sinew. The soles were thick, layered leather, designed for gripping mountain rock and deep mud. I ain't paying you off, Emmett said roughly, his gaze dropping to the boots. I spent the last 2 months working that hide, measured 'em against your old ones while you were sleeping. Cora stared at the boots. She reached out, running a calloused thumb over the soft, oiled leather. It was pliable, warm. She could see the hours of labor in the tight, even stitches. It was the most intimate, careful thing anyone had ever made for her. Gold is for leaving, Emmett said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. Boots are for staying. He didn't say, times I love you. He didn't drop to his bad knee and make flowery promises. He was a mountain man. His words were scarce, but his actions were absolute. He had given her the means to leave a rich woman, and the means to stay comfortably by his side. The choice was entirely hers. Cora looked up at him. The cynical, hardened shell she had built around her heart cracked, just a fraction. She reached out, bypassing the pile of gold entirely, and picked up one of the boots. She sat down on the wooden chair, pulled off her ragged, stiff shoe, and slid her foot into the new boot. It fit perfectly. It felt like walking on moss. She looked up at Emmett, a small, genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth for the first time in 6 months. The mud is thick out there today, Cora said softly. I suppose I'll need to test these out. The wood box is getting low. Emmett let out a long, shaky breath, the tension draining out of his broad shoulders. He nodded slowly, a fierce, quiet light settling in his dark eyes. I'll sharpen the axe, he said. Neither of them touched the gold. It sat on the table, a pile of useless metal, while the two of them walked out the door together, side by side, into the wet, thawing earth of the mountain. If you felt the chill of the mountain and the heat of Cora's survival, hit that like button. Every share helps us bring more gritty, untold stories of the Wild West to life. Did Emmett's rough repayment win you over, or would you have taken the gold and ran? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next incredible journey. Drop a comment below. Would you have chosen the boots or the gold? Let us know.